Hello everyone, I am the Enforcer, and we are back at it again with today's news from day 65. The Ukrainians were not expected to last longer than 48 to 72 hours in this war, yet here we are on day 65, an entire 2 months and nearly 1 week into the war, and the Ukrainians are still holding. It's unbelievable at this point, honestly, to believe that they've been holding this well, but today we have gotten a little bit of unfortunate news from the Ukrainian government saying that the eastern front, with the renewed offensive by the Russians in that area, has practically been a bloodbath for both sides, although the Ukrainians are claiming that the Russians are still taking a higher amount of casualties. We'll of course be going over that news today later on in the stream, but with that, let's go over tonight's schedule. Starting off, we're going to be covering the location unknowns first tonight. We actually don't have any news from the Kyiv area or the Northern Front, the former Northern Front in general, and so we cannot cover anything there. So we will start off in the location unknowns. We will then travel into Russia to the city of Voronezh, and we'll cover the 2 pieces of news we've gotten there, and then we'll take a 3-question segment break, so that way we can answer 3 questions from the chat. We will then go back to the news, and we'll cover the news that occurred in Kharkiv, and we'll also move down towards the Donbas as well, and cover all of this news in one large segment as well. Then we will take another 3 questions at the end of that segment, and then we will finally move on to some of the Mariupol news we've seen today, some of the news around Zaporizhia, the Black Sea, Moldova, and then we'll wrap up with the international news that's left here in California in the United States. I'd also like everyone to know that the elusive video is actually going to be filmed tomorrow. We will be clocking in one of those massive 18-hour days again, so unfortunately we will probably be blitzed by the end of the thing. Well, not, I don't think blitzed in that way. We'll be burnt out, I guess that's a better way of saying it, because it's a pretty long day whenever we do filming. Last time it was an 18-hour day where we pretty much got up and worked until the end of the day. So hopefully it's not that long, but hopefully we can make sure to get a very good video out of it as well. So with that, I'm not going to hold y'all much longer, and we're going to get straight into the location unknown news. Starting off with the first bit of news we can see today, we can actually see for one of the first times in the history of this war, the Russians did not get lucky even on their own propaganda video. So I'm going to let y'all see this. We can actually see here in this video that the Russians did come under fire, and one of their soldiers was in fact shot. The video is not graphic, but of course if you are a little bit squeamish to this kind of thing, I suggest that you click off the video and come back here in about 2 minutes, because the video does show someone getting shot, although it's not entirely graphic. Also, on top of this, we can also see that this really took them by surprise. I actually think that this may have been one of those set-up Russian films that we've seen a lot before, where they just run across the street and there's no one out there watching them, and then somehow a defender got set up in a position to fire on them and actually hit one of them. So I'm not going to elaborate about it too much. The video pretty much speaks for itself, so I'm going to let it run, and we're just going to see what happens. So first we can see the Russians running across the open area to the other building on the other side of this opening. Oh my god, it's going to turn into a slideshow, isn't it? Let me refresh that. Let me see if they'll fix it. I don't know if it becomes a slideshow because it's been removed by the mods? Apparently it was over-reported. So we're just gonna keep... Oh, my lord. Let's see if it fixes itself. Oh my lord. It does not fix itself. How am I gonna get through this? Well, we're just gonna watch the slideshow. I'm sorry about that, y'all. But right there, one of the soldiers had been shot and had fallen to the ground, and one of the Russian infantrymen returned to the fallen soldier and was trying to pick him up and drag him. Unfortunately, it is a slideshow. I don't know why the internet reception here is good, but now we can see a second soldier running out and also trying to get the wounded soldier out of the area. We can also see if the video was actually not a slideshow, one soldier covering fire. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to end that video a little bit early because in this state, it's very hard to watch. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next video. Here in the next bit of Location Unknown news, we can see a Russian strike on Ukrainian positions. Of course, it's always unfortunate to hear that the Ukrainians do take losses. Apparently, they're taking a larger amount of losses now than they have during the entirety of this war, which is, of course, unfortunate to hear. But there is good news in that, and that is knowing that the Russians have not managed to take any meaningful amount of ground during the entire duration of this offensive that they've been in for 9 days now. So with that in mind, let's watch this very unfortunate video. So here in this video, you can see a building. I'm not really sure if it's some kind of farm storage building or a barn, but we can see Ukrainian soldiers around the building. And then here in this next clip, you can actually see a ballistic missile hit that building directly, unfortunately. We don't know how many casualties were caused by that hit, but it does appear that the explosion was incredibly large and may have leveled the building entirely and killed most of the defenders, sadly. Nonetheless, we do know that they are holding that side of the country, and so I want to make sure that everyone keeps that in mind whenever we see losses like this. The Russians aren't flooring the Ukrainians and then pushing through them. They're flooring them here and there like we see in these videos, but the Ukrainians are holding the line by and large across the entirety of the southeastern front. So, of course, that is good to know. But it's still very unfortunate to see Ukrainian soldiers die, and I hope they are given a proper burial and their bodies are recovered, because it's still such a sad thing to see something like this happen, and they deserve all the respect in the world, considering that they're defending their country along with the rest of Eastern Europe. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of Location Unknown news, where we can see Ukrainian MLRSs firing. Of course, this is some standard footage. We've seen a lot of stuff like this, but it's still good to show because it shows that the Ukrainian artillery is working overtime at the moment. But here's the video. As you can see, they have multiple MLRSs in this battery firing at the same time. And so with that, that's the end of that video. Pretty self-explanatory. It's just MLRS is firing, so there's not really much to add to that. And so we're now going to move on to the next bit of Location Unknown news, where we can actually see one of the videos that was included in the Enforcer short clips. Here we can see the 1129th Anti-Air Missile Regiment destroy a Russian aircraft. This is not the entire video that was on the short clip. It actually showed the external footage from that clip as well, but in this one, it just shows the interior of the anti-aircraft vehicle. And so with that, I'm going to unmute this, and we're going to watch the video. At this moment, they're trying to lock up the Russian aircraft. What you're seeing here is the TV screen where they actually look at the aircraft they're trying to fire at. They have now fired the surface-to-air missile, and you can actually see the smoke trail of it right there. They're now zooming in to try and get a better view of the Russian aircraft. And the missile was a direct hit and took the aircraft down. Of course, the Ukrainian soldiers are heavily excited, and of course, reasonably so. Shooting down a Russian aircraft is a large amount of loss monetarily for the Russian military, and it's also a huge loss in terms of the Russians' ability to continue their aerial operations over Ukraine. At the moment, we do know that the Ukrainians control most of the skies over Ukraine, and some of the areas that they don't control entirely are nothing more than contested. So that's, of course, incredibly good news to hear, because we know that the Russian Air Force cannot be used to its fullest extent, which does give the Ukrainians the upper hand at this time in terms of the air war. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of Location Unknown news, where we can see a Russian soldier getting rudely interrupted by Ukrainian artillery. I'm going to let y'all see what he says, and then we're going to replay it, and I'm going to give a little bit of a context of what he's actually saying, because I actually got a translation today on this one.
Выполнено на 5 с плюсом. Суммарно у нас 3 трехсотых.
So quite an interesting video there. And now let me explain what he said. He said, at this first part, we've taken out the Ukrainians and we suffered very little casualties, only about 3 wounded. And then the mortar shell lands right in front of him, and we're assuming, since it was so close, that you can actually see the explosion of the mortar shell right here, that he may actually be dead. So with that in mind, you can get the idea that apparently they didn't take minimal casualties. Apparently, with him speaking about the wounded, he actually became the first 400, which means that he was, of course, killed. So with that, that's a very interesting video to see, and it's kind of a little ironic in a way in how he was trying to brag about how they had taken no casualties and wiped the Ukrainians out, quote-unquote, and then he becomes the first casualty the unit had, according to his information. So with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of news. Also, we're not going to go back. It was pretty much just a phone flipping through the air, but you could clearly see that in both parts of the film. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where you can see Ukrainian UR-77 anti-mine vehicle, I believe, in action. A mine-clearing vehicle, that's the correct terminology for this vehicle. It's a very interesting system. It actually fires a... Hang on, correction. For some reason they said in the title, it's Ukrainian, but we can actually clearly see a Z on it. So I'm going to correct that. That's actually a Russian UR-77 mine clearing vehicle, just so that way we don't have that misconception going on. So now you can see the vehicle firing the charge. The charge will then extend as far as the line allows it to. And now you can hear the line tighten up and then slacken. And correction, real quick, it's actually 200, not 400. For some reason, I got those confused. Sorry about that, y'all. But anyways, we're going to continue on with this video.
Давай!
So now you can see him watching the mine clearing vehicle. Nothing has happened at the moment, and I don't really know what they fired the mine clearing vehicle's line at. So at the moment we don't really have a lot of information, but we can now see another video of them launching the mine. Very interesting. We can now hear the line tighten and then slacken on that one as well. It appears that they're using these in a large amount, because we can see here a compilation of 3 launches of the mine-clearing charge. And so this is incredibly interesting, and it's showing that the Russians are starting to use this vehicle in large amounts, because this is not the first time that we've seen a UR-77 being used. We've seen instances of this vehicle being used in Mariupol, and also, I believe, in Popasna, if I'm correct. And with that, that's the end of that video. Hopefully the Ukrainians can wipe out these vehicles. I'm not really sure if they've even destroyed any of these vehicles before, but now that they're being used in large numbers, I'm sure it's only going to be a matter of time before one of these falls victim to a drone or a Stugna. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see BMPs destroyed by bomblets. This was once again another location unknown video, and also one of the Enforcer short clips we had today. So some of y'all may have actually seen this earlier. But with that, I'm now going to show the footage. Starting off, you can see the BMP here beside some kind of complex. I'm not exactly sure what kind, but we can now see the drone dropping the bomblet. And it appears that it hit towards the front of the BMP on the left side, somewhere near the driver's compartment. We can now see that the tank is starting to brew up. And the second BMP, it actually looks like the bomblet drops directly behind the turret, more towards the area that's used to carry infantry. And we now see it explode, and we can actually see a large plume coming out of the top of the turret to the back of it, which does tell us that the tank was penetrated by the explosion, and that one for sure has been destroyed entirely. And so with that, that is the end of that video. It's once again good to see that the Ukrainians are managing to take out armored personnel carriers and tanks at the same rate, if not an even higher rate now than they have been during the entirety of the war, and hopefully the Russians will not be able to maintain these kinds of losses for too long, although they supposedly on paper have around 12,000 tanks and some, I believe 20,000 APCs. But with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see an Mi-35 escorting a Russian column. This is actually a video from the Russian forces, so that kind of explains where it came from, if anyone was wondering. But we can see here that it is an Mi-35. You can tell it's an Mi-35 rather than your normal Mi-24 that a lot of people are familiar with, because the landing gear on the Mi-35 are actually in a fixed position and cannot retract inside of the helicopter, which is something they did to simplify the design process and the manufacturing of the Mi-35. So with that, here's the video. Now, one thing I'd like to note is that while it's supposed to be providing some kind of a cover or an escort to this convoy, it's so low to the ground, I don't really think it would be effective in any of those roles. It's really just like a fast vehicle at this point with the altitude it has. So with that, that is the end of this video. Not really much to comment on. It's just an Mi-35 giving an escort to a Russian column. And so we're now going to move on to the last two bits of location unknown news. The last one's really cute. It's a little dog. But with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of location unknown news, where we can see a drone pilot with amazing skills. And I don't know if the music in this is copyrighted. I'm not entirely sure. But we are going to play it because it really was really tricky situation here. I'm going to explain it real quick and then let the video play. So what we were seeing here, and I didn't show the whole video because it was very slow, but some Russians got in a firefight in a village. One of them got wounded, and so a second soldier was going to commandeer a civilian vehicle along with the wounded one and then drive him off, most likely to a field hospital. What they did not know is that there was a drone watching them the entire time, and once they started to get into this car, the drone dropped a bomblet, and you're about to watch the bomblet fly through the sunroof and inside the car and then explode. This is something that I don't think we've ever seen before on film. This is like a needle in a haystack kind of thing to see, and it's very weird on top of that. So I'm just going to let y'all see the video, and I'm also going to unmute it because the music does add kind of a nice touch. Also, you can see one of the Russian soldiers who helped the wounded man into the vehicle. He turns around and he runs off, and I don't even think he knows what happened behind him. But anyways, here's the video. I don't think they made it out. So with that was a bit unfortunate, but still, it was crazy that the drone pilot managed to drop the bomblet through the sunroof. So that was a very weird video and a very incredibly rare one on top of that. So I just gotta say that was just a wild video. That's something incredibly rare that we don't really see at all. We haven't seen that until this point, and so I just wanted to show that, although it is a little bit morbid in a way. Just because it was such a feat that the bomblet was that accurate and managed to pretty much hit such a shot, if you would call it that. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the last bit of location unknown news. Now we've gotten past the bit of a morbid part. We're now going to move on to a little bit of sweet news, where we can see a cute little dog holding a Ukrainian flag. I like this. Of course, it's cute, and it's nice to take a reprieve from such thing as what we just saw, you know, thinking about the context of it. And so here's a dog holding a Ukrainian flag. Oh, it's got copyrighted music. Sorry about that. So I'm just going to show you the little dog. It's standing on its hind legs and holding a Ukrainian flag. Pretty cute, if you ask me. I'm a huge fan of dogs, of course. I have 2 corgis, and I love them to death. And so this is a pretty sweet little thing to see. And it's also doing a very nice little trick. I'd like a dog like that, honestly. I think it's an Australian Shepherd. But anyways, we have now reached the end of all the location unknown news. So we're now going to move on inside of Russia, where we can see today that the Russians are apparently having a pretty rough time in Voronezh all around, both domestically and militarily. So, first off, we can see that there was a little bit of an interesting protest today, as a Russian man was wearing a shirt with a Ukrainian flag on it, and apparently the inscription read, according to the caption, "Eternal memory to the Russian occupiers." Now, this is a very interesting one here, because we can actually see these Russians filming him and harassing him. And then we can actually see the police arrest him. of course, the Russians are incredibly strict when it comes to war propaganda. They make sure that it's all supportive of their side. And if anything is against that side, unlike the United States where you just get cussed out or something, they'll arrest you over there. And so it's unfortunate to see that the man got arrested, but I am glad that he's sticking up for the right side because we know that the Russians have killed thousands, if not tens of thousands of civilians at this point. Although we don't have a confirmed number, we know that it's definitely nearing the tens of thousands at this point. So I am glad that there are some Russians who can see through the propaganda that the Russian government is feeding to them and actually know that the Ukrainians are in the right, we're not the aggressors, and also have been victims of Russian aggression. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the last bit of the news in Voronezh, where we can actually see that the Russians are not doing any better on the home front than they are doing in battle as well. As we can see in this video, the Russians slammed an anti-air system into a bridge. You can't make this stuff up. I don't know how they didn't get the bridge clearance idea for this. Like, hey, maybe this trailer has a vehicle on it that's a little too tall to get under this bridge. But nonetheless, they went for it, and then they paid the price. As you can see here, the anti-aircraft system has been heavily damaged by hitting this bridge. And so I'm sure that this vehicle will no longer be usable, at least for a decent while, as they have to try and repair it now before it can be sent to the front. And so with that, that is the end of the news in Russia. You can just get an idea of how incompetent the Russians must be, considering that their average Russian soldier cannot even get a good guesstimation of how tall that bridge is versus how tall the trailer with the vehicle on it is. So with that, that is the end of the news inside of Russia for today, and we're now going to start moving back towards the Kharkiv area and also the Donbas region as well. But before we do, we're going to move on to 3 questions from the chat. And so with that, what do we got, Matthew?
So, good afternoon, everybody. It's Enforcer Matt once again coming back with you on day 65 of the news. It's good to see everybody back. Welcome back to our channel regulars. And if you're new, we're glad to have you. So, first up tonight, we have a $20 donation from HT who says, do you think something significant will happen on May the 9th, either by the Russians or by the Ukrainians?
I'm not entirely sure if anything will happen on May the 9th. I believe if the Russians are able to take the Donbass in an incredibly short amount of time, at the moment, I believe... Let me check my calendar just to make sure. No, I don't have to. May 9th is 9 days, of course, after the 1st of May. And so we have tomorrow. And so that gives them 10 days to take the entire Donbass. And if they're able to do that, then I'm sure that they'll make Victory Day a huge deal, because as far as we know right now, that is the plan with their objectives, is to just take the Donbass and then claim that they achieved their objectives inside of Ukraine as a whole. Although we know their original goal was to actually annex the country in its entirety and install a puppet government that's suited to Russia's wishes. So if they were able to do that in 10 days, which looks impossible at this point considering the amount of ground they'd have to cover, I'm sure they'd make May 9th a huge deal and it'd be a special occasion. But I believe if they're not able to make that happen by May 9th, it's going to be an incredibly uneventful day by and large. Nothing's really going to happen, I believe. But then again, that's just my assumption, because while May 9th is a huge propaganda deal, they're not going to do anything crazy on May 9th as well, because they still have to think about things in the long-term picture. And if they were to use like a tactical nuke on Ukraine on May 9th because they still hadn't achieved their objectives, then May 9th would become the worst day in Russian history, because that's when the United States and the rest of NATO would get directly involved, because that's one of the lines in the sand that we've drawn, is that there will be no nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons used against Ukraine, or military intervention will occur from NATO countries. So I hope that kind of answers the question in a way, and I thank you so much for the support. Every little bit of support we get on this channel helps us to load, and it helps us to continue doing what we do. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And up next, we have a $20 donation from Neil Wojan, who says, sorry for the double question earlier. I didn't catch the first answer. But with that being said, as a student of history, can you confirm if Ukraine's mighty Tachankas had leaf springs?
Yes, they did have leaf springs. We've seen that before. And to some of y'all who may be new, a leaf spring is a form of suspension on a large amount of vehicles, actually still to this day. But I got that wrong a while ago and said it must have been an old type of suspension system. But yes, Tachankas actually do have leaf springs on them. Most wagons were made with leaf springs, and so the answer is yes. So I hope that answers your question, and I thank you so much for the support. It does help out our channel a whole lot. Also, make sure to like it if you do enjoy the stream and you're liking the information that you're getting. And with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And Enforcer, is there any way you can bump up my volume just a tad bit because I'm getting some reports that my volume is low?
Sure, I can try that real quick. Let me turn up that desktop audio to right there. Sorry, y'all had to see behind the scenes there for a second. But with that, let's continue on to the next question.
All right, and we had just been paid a visit by the webcam bot, which has now been destroyed. So moving on to the next question, we have a $20 donation from Anita, who says, "No matter what the country, dead is dead. A human has died and deserves at least that much respect, love for humanity, and Slava Ukraine."
Horom Slava. And also to answer that question, yes, I do believe that is the case. Although sometimes with the Russians, not trying to be morbid or anything, but they have killed so many civilians that they've kind of lost that they've kind of lost a large deal of that respect in most people's eyes, and somewhat in mine, although I do try and make sure to at least respect the death to some degree, but still, I do believe that everyone who has been killed deserves at least some respect for having to been a person at some point, regardless of what their beliefs were. So I heavily agree with you, and I thank you very much for the support. And with that, we're going to move on to one last question, and then we're going to move on to the Kharkiv and Donbas news.
And our last question of this segment goes to S. Moore, who puts in a $15 donation and says, "Marvelous Meredith, the blue eyed sockeye salmon, delivers a question from the Atlantic salmon. They ask, is Putin now a prisoner of his own propaganda? What say you, Enforcer?"
I believe he may actually be a prisoner of his own propaganda. We do know that so far the war has gone poorly for the Russians on paper and also statistically. We've seen them withdraw from the Northern Front entirely, which was something that was believed to have been impossible until it actually happened by most analysts. That was due mostly because of the logistical situation that they had in the north and also the northeast, because they had too many supply hubs at that point, and it was too complicated of an operation for the Russians to perform, considering that they are limited in their strategic scope. And so, with that, they had to withdraw from the area because they really couldn't keep up the offensive anymore, and they were then losing land and also taking heavy losses trying to hold the amount of land that they had covered, which was still insignificant by and large. So we know that it went poorly in the north, and we can see here in the south, while the Ukrainians have admitted they're taking a higher amount of casualties now than they have through the rest of the war, they are still holding the majority of the ground in the southeast. In fact, we haven't seen the Russians make any major movements down there for the past 9 days during this entire offensive. So that gives us a pretty fair idea that the Russians are not going to be doing all too well at all in the future. And considering that the talks are actually falling apart right now from what the Ukrainians are saying, and it's due to the Russians getting tired of them, I do believe that the higher-ups in the government, much like Putin, and probably just Putin especially, believe that the war is actually going well and that there is some way to win it. So to answer your question in short, I can agree that I think that Putin has become a victim of his own propaganda schemes. And so I thank you very much for the support, and I hope that answers the question, at least as far as my opinion is concerned. Of course, I could be wrong. He may actually know the true situation, but he's not letting the Russian public know that he knows. So thank you once again for the support, and with that, we've reached the end of this question segment. If you have put in a super chat with a question attached, we will, of course, get to that by the end of the night. But for now, we're going to return back to the news, starting in Kharkiv, where today we've seen that there was once a BMD-4 that was Russian, and it appears that it was hit by an explosive of such scale that it's not even recognizable as a vehicle anymore. This was actually once a BMD-4, and just for y'all to remember, this is what a BMD-4 looks like when it's actually intact. So this is a BMD-4, and that's the picture we have of the remains of this BMD-4. So I don't know what the Ukrainians hit that with, but it must have been a sizable explosion because that's not even recognizable anymore. So with that, we're now going to move on to the next bit of news, just slightly north of Kharkiv, where we can see a pile of used grad missiles near Kharkiv. I believe that these are actually grad missiles that were fired into the city by the Russian side, and you can see here that it is a massive pile of them, hundreds if not maybe even 1,000 of them in this one spot. And we don't really know how many piles of munitions are around the city like this anymore. There could be multiples of these piles all around the city, because we know that the city of Kharkiv endured massive amounts of MLRS attacks during the first month and a half of the war, and now it's become less frequent, much less frequent than it was at one point, but we still know that they do endure missile attacks, and that the volume of rockets that have landed within the perimeter of Kharkiv must be incredibly high. So I'm sure that this isn't even reflective of all of the leftover missiles that are pretty much just left around inside of the city. And so with that, we've actually reached the end of the Kharkiv news. And to touch on this area of the front, we actually got an address from President Zelensky today, although I didn't include it in tonight's stream, and he stated that the situation in the Kharkiv is difficult. I don't really know what exactly he meant by that because that's all he said, but I'm believing that the Ukrainians are getting a decent amount of pushback here, and they may be unsure about their situation here in the Kharkiv area. Hopefully the Ukrainian soldiers can hold, but once again, they can't win every battle, but you can still win the war. And so with that, we're now going to move further on down the front to the area of Izium, where today we've seen a large amount of action from both, well, really just the Ukrainian side, as it seems that they've been trying to slow the Russian advance in that area and try and curb the amount of power it's able to levy against the Ukrainians. So starting off, we can actually see the Ukrainian grads hitting Russian forces in the area. So I'm going to let y'all see that video real quick. As you see here, it's on a computer screen. Someone else is recording it. But you can see a large amount of rockets landing and exploding, of course, in the barrage. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly where the Russian forces are within that barrage. But from the video description, it does seem that it is hitting Russian forces, although we don't know what kind, whether it be infantry or armored vehicles. But this clip right here, this bit, actually gives you an incredibly good idea of the spread of an MLRS. An MLRS, for those of you who may not know, is a multiple, let me make sure I get the name of it correct. I just want to make sure. MLRS stands for, I'm pretty sure I know what it stands for, multiple launch rockets. I was going to say that, but I was like, it can't be launch. I was like, that's too simplistic, but it is launch. MLRS stands for multiple launch rocket system. We've seen loads of these. You actually saw some operating earlier in the video, which were BM-21 grads from the Ukrainian side. And what these do is that they just fired a large amount of rockets downrange, multiple miles, sometimes around 15 miles or even 50 miles away, depending on the size, and they all land in a large area. As you can see here, it's blanketed like an area that probably has a radius of about a quarter mile, or maybe even a little bit wider, and so that gives you the idea of the destructive scope of a MLRS battery being aimed and fired into one spot, as we can see here with this Russian infantry or armored unit being attacked. And with that, we're now going to move on to the next video, where we can actually see that the Ukrainian artillery forces struck Russian forces again in the area today. As we can see in this video, the artillery barrage looked to be much more accurate, and I believe it may have been conducted with normal artillery pieces. As you can see here in this part of the video, I'm going to rewind it actually real quick so that way we can talk about what we're seeing. We're seeing 3 Russian tanks. It appears that they're trying to advance through an open field in something of a V formation. We don't actually see any infantry around them at this point in the video, although that may change. We can actually see that one of the artillery shells hit the tank in the center of the formation dead on, and has now caused the tank to brew up, causing an ammo detonation, most likely killing the 3 crew members that are inside of that tank. We can now actually see the other 2 tanks here withdrawing and actually going in reverse from where the first tank exploded. And now we can see that the camera angle has changed, and we can now see another artillery strike hit near the surviving tank on the right side of this formation. Incredibly close, but not dead on. The tank is still functional. I'm not sure if that is the tank. It does look like those are tracks from one of the tanks. We can still see that this tank here in the center is still brewing up. We have not seen the crew bail so far in this video, so I'm assuming that it would be a safe assumption to make that that crew was in fact killed in the explosion. It was very instantaneous, and it was very violent, so unfortunately that crew wasn't able to make it out and surrender to a Ukrainian unit. But you now see another Russian tank being hit there by an artillery shell and going up in a large blaze. And I've honestly got to tell you, my personal assessment, and of course this is just my personal assessment, so take it with a grain of salt, is that Russian tanks seem to be at an incredible disadvantage in modern war. We've seen them be destroyed by most ATGM weapons that the Ukrainians have been able to field, and we've also seen them now being destroyed by artillery in incredibly large amounts over the course of this war. I'm not really sure how the Ukrainians are able to accurately land artillery fire on a Russian tank, considering it's such a small target for an artillery shell to hit, so I'm assuming that they may be using some kind of smart-guided artillery munitions to be able to hit these tanks the way they are. We can see here that one of the tanks must have popped smoke charges there and is now trying to retreat across the field. I believe that is the tank right there. We can now see what may be another tank back here that is now brewing up again, but in an incredibly small way. Not like the violent explosions we saw from the other two tanks earlier in the video. And so with that is the end of the video. Of course, it's always good to see that the Ukrainians are able to inflict massive amounts of damage on Russian units, and especially in the area of Izium, where we know that for the past 9 days, the Russians have been launching an offensive specifically from this area with somewhere around 20 to 22 battalion tactical groups, which means that there's about 18,000 troops in that area trying to push out of Izium and down through this yellow area towards Slovyansk. So, of course, it is incredibly good to know that the Ukrainians are curbing the assaults that have been launched from Izium. And finally, with the last bit of news in that area, we can actually see some footage from the ground as one of the Ukrainian soldiers shows the aftermath of the battle near Izium. And so I'm going to let y'all see this. You can not really see a lot in this video, but you can see pillars of smoke rising from the ground out in the distance, most likely from destroyed Russian vehicles.
А вот там мы пыталась штурмовать. И нам очередной раз дали пизды хорошей. 200-х опять есть, забрать не можем.
Now we can hear an artillery strike landing incredibly close to the soldier.
Нихуя себе!
Luckily, he got out of it unscathed. That's incredibly good to know, but that shell did land incredibly close. And the great thing that we can see from that video, while that was very harrowing, is that the Ukrainians are not only destroying the Russian units from artillery, it appears that the infantry are also holding up fairly well against the Russian advances, because we actually saw a Ukrainian infantryman standing in the middle of a quiet battlefield until that artillery shell landed, showing the aftermath of what had occurred. So with that is the end of the news in the Izium area. As of now, we still know that the Russians have made no significant ground or advances from the Izium area, which has been one of the most important areas of the front, and one of the most dangerous as well for the Ukrainians, because if a breakthrough was made from Izium, they could actually go south to Slovyansk, and then push all the way down to Bakhmut, and cut off all the Ukrainians here and surround them, which would put them in a massive pocket, which would of course be detrimental to the Ukrainians, because tens of thousands of soldiers are currently fighting on the front lines in this area, and so they'd be cut off from their supply lines, and then they would be the pocket would of course have pressure put on it until it either imploded and the Ukrainians surrendered, or until all of the defenders were killed. And so fortunately, the assault at Izium is being held at the moment. And so we're now going to move on further towards the Donbas area, and we're going to go to the town of Lyman. I'm not exactly sure which way it's pronounced, but we're going to go to this major railhead here, where we can see that there has been a Russian strike near that city today. I've actually heard some conflicting reports that apparently Lyman may actually be part of the front line now. I have not heard any news about the Russians breaking through at Kreminna or Rubizhny to start heading down this way, and also there aren't any major roads here, like these major highways that we've seen the Russians pushing on so far, to support any kind of operations in that direction logistically, but the Russians may be trying something new here, which would be a shocker to me, and of course I'm going to try and keep up with as much as possible to make sure that we can get the best news, the most accurate news, and adjust our maps accordingly to show the true situation on the front lines. But at this moment, we don't have enough information to confirm that Russian forces have made it near the town of Lyman, or Lyman. I'm not exactly sure which way it's pronounced once again, sorry if I'm butchering it, but still, here's a video of the Russian strike near Izium, well, Lyman. Sorry, correction, y'all. So you can see artillery strikes landing around these Ukrainian units. You can now see a large amount of Ukrainian soldiers running down what appeared to be a ditch on the side of this tree line. and we can now see one of their vehicles get hit. What's good to know, though, is that we know that all of the infantry that were running down that ditch on the side of the road were actually from that truck and dismounted the vehicle. So all of them most likely got out of that situation unscathed, if not with light wounds, and we know that there wasn't any massive casualties on the Ukrainian side, which is, of course, good to know. Vehicles, like trucks, are somewhat easier to replace than that many soldiers. And so with that, that is the end of that video, and that's all the news we've gotten out of the Lehman area. I'm going to call it Lehman, just because I feel like that would be the correct pronunciation. And so with that, we're now going to move further on down to the Donbas area, and we're going to start off in the Luhansk region, where today we've seen in the town of Ermino another bit of drone footage of that ammo storage that blew up several days ago. That was actually the first Enforcer short clip on this channel. So I'm going to let y'all see this. This is actually entirely new footage, although this is a couple of days old at this point. This is the first time anyone's seen it here on the internet. And so we can actually see the ammo depot in question right there. We can now see a close-up of it from the drone. You can actually see multiple different logistical vehicles all around. We can actually see a large amount of logistical vehicles that seem to be involved in the operation of the Smerch MLRSs, which are, I'll pull it up for y'all real quick, actually, just in case if some of y'all may not remember what the Smerch is. This is what the Smerch MLRS looks like. The Smerch fires a, let me make sure I'm correct. Let's just go to the Wikipedia page and let me make sure. It fires a 300 millimeter rocket, missile, whatever you would like to call it. It fires a 300 millimeter rocket. And of course, these things are mammoths to resupply. It takes a huge effort. It takes 3 vehicles, the launcher itself, the supply trucks that we actually see in this video here that carry the rockets, and then they have to have an entirely separate vehicle with a crane on it to then load those rockets into the launcher. So I believe this entire ammo storage is revolving around the supply and operation of Smerch MLRSs in the area. And so with that, we can actually see them now identify all of the vehicles that are around this ammo storage. And we're now about to see the Ukrainians conduct a strike on it and see it go up in a ball of fire. Sorry for the stutter there, but we can actually see that the ammo storage there blew up entirely, and you can tell that the explosion is, of course, incredibly large. We can see here in this video, that is almost a full village here to the right of this explosion, which gives you an idea of the scale of how large this explosion actually was. Now we can see small fires burning all over the area as the embers from the explosion fell to the ground and continued to burn and have now caught the surrounding woods on fire. In a very large area, actually, we can still see that the ammo stowage is still exploding a pretty decent bit. And of course, this kind of damage is incredibly beneficial for the Ukrainians to conduct, much more so than actually destroying frontline vehicles, because frontline vehicles require fuel, ammunition, and men to keep running. And if the Ukrainians are able to destroy the fuel, ammunition, and men before they can get to the front lines, that means those tanks are no longer able to operate. And so, the Ukrainians have pretty much won the war in a passive way. Instead of having to directly destroy the vehicles at one after the other, they can just destroy the source of where they get their supplies to keep going. And now we can actually see the video that was the Enforcer short clip from a distance away of that ammo storage exploding. We can now see another bit of footage that appears to be of an MLRS barrage, maybe in the area at night, because it did look like it was nighttime. And with that, that's the end of the video. We know that the Ukrainians, of course, did a great service to themselves and the defense of the country in that area, blowing up the ammo storage, and so hopefully that has slowed down the ammo consumption of the Smerches and will make sure that they're used less and less against civilian population areas. We know that the Russians, unlike the Ukrainians, actually use their MLRSs in kind of like a broad blanketing kind of action where they just pick a city like Severodonetsk, they aim the MLRSs into the city, and then they just fire them at the city. And so they land really anywhere in it, and y'all saw from the video where the Ukrainians were firing the MLRSs into pretty much that open field where the Russian forces were, you can get an idea of how large the spread on those rockets are, and so you can imagine the amount of damage that an MLRS would do to a residential block in an area like Severodonetsk. It would cause massive amounts of damage and most likely a large amount of casualties as well. And so I hope that the Russians who continue to conduct these artillery barrages on these cities are found and will be held accountable for their crimes at the end of this war. And so with that, we're now going to move on to Popasna, which has of course become a major part in this war, and I believe that this may be the launching point for them to try and reach Slovyansk from the south. As of this moment, we know that the LPR and the pro-Russian, well, the pro-Russian forces in general, which is called the LPR pro-Russian, and the Russian forces along with them, have not managed to break through the lines here at Popasna and begin their march towards Bakhmut and then up towards Slovyansk. At the moment, they're still being held at Popasna 9 days into this offensive, and so we're going to go over the news we've seen there today. Starting off, we've seen another Stugna attack near Popasna, taking out another Russian main battle tank. Hopefully this was... We're going to have to go to Twitter. Sorry about that, y'all. But here we go. Let me get on here real quick. Alright, so here we can see the crosshairs of the Stugna. We can already see that the ATGM is on the way, and it appears that the tank is right there. We now see the Stugna hit the tank in just a second. And the tank, of course, brews up like every single video we've ever seen of a Stugna attack. And we can, of course, hear the crew flip out, because whenever anyone does something like that, you know, consider... Well, I'm kind of getting a little bit ahead of myself and kind of tripping over my words there. Let me explain what I'm trying to say a little bit better. These guys are nothing more than just regular people, and they're standing around just like us, and they're looking at this armored behemoth. Behemoth. That's a better pronunciation of that. Sorry, I'm butchering that. Anyways, they're looking at this armored behemoth in the distance, made of homogeneous steel, quartz armor, ERA blocks, contact 5, the whole lot, depending on what kind of tank it is. And we see them standing there with nothing more than a missile launcher and a little computer screen, and they launched this ATGM at that tank and managed to take it out. So you can kind of get the idea of how excited they are to think that they're just little men going up against an armored steel machine, and they're able to take it out with something that seems as simple as a Stugna. So, of course, it's always good to hear that they are excited and they are defending their country, and I'm sure that morale is incredibly high in that anti-tank unit, because their cheers alone are probably enough to get everyone riled up in that area and make sure that they'll keep the good fight going. And so with that, we're now going to move on to the second bit of news that we've gotten from the Popasna area, where we can see a Ukrainian MLRS firing in the region. We, of course, don't know exactly where that marker is, a little inaccurate, but it was in the Luhansk region, most likely near Popasna. So I'm going to let y'all see this video. Of course, it's just a usual MLRS firing, but this is from a pretty good distance away. And so we could see there that it was a Ukrainian MLRS firing. Hopefully it hit its target incredibly well, and it made sure that the Russian advance did not make it further into the country. And with that, we've covered all the news in the Popasna area, and we're now going to move further down the front into the Donetsk region, where we've had a sizable amount of news today. Here near the town of Yenikievi, I believe that's how I pronounce it. I'm sorry if I butchered that, once again, to my Ukrainian speakers. But we can see missiles fired from the area. We're not exactly sure what kind. We're not really sure if these are air defense missiles, if they're some kind of ballistic missiles. We're not really sure, but we did see missiles being fired, and we will try and get more information about what specific kind of missiles these were if we can. So we can see the trails from the first missiles that were fired, and we can now see what may be the third or the fourth missile being fired upwards into the air. Of course, we're not entirely sure what these are, what specific kind of missile this is. We can now see them staring around a little bit. And we can now hear a bit of the rocket fire itself, you know, the sound of the missile taking flight now, but just very faintly, which tells us that this was actually a pretty good distance away from the filmer. And so with that, that's the end of that video. Not really much to see there, and so we're now going to move on to the next bit of news that is actually on the front line near Orlivka, and we can see that a tank was knocked out today around that area. And so with that, we're going to let y'all see this. It, of course, is pretty normal. It's just the Ukrainians taking out another Russian main battle tank, this time on a tree line somewhere in the area. Also, something else that's interesting that I'd like to note about the specific tank, I am assuming that it's a T-72, because when it fires, you can actually see a bit of the smoke from the charge actually come out of the ejection port on the back of the turret. So that does tell me that that's most likely a T-72 series tank, if it's any kind of tank. So we can now see it sitting there. It's most likely reloading at that moment. And now we can see it retreating back into the tree line. That's definitely a T-72B3 for sure. We can now see a different angle of that tree line, and it looks like that was where the T-72B3 was, and we can now see that it was hit by either an artillery strike or some kind of drone strike dead on, and the tank is now brewing up. I'm not really sure if the crew was able to bail out of that one, but still, it's very interesting to see that the drone wasn't even looking at it. And I'm assuming that the drone was coordinating the fire on this tank. The drone wasn't even looking at the direction, yet the hit was still accurate, which was very interesting to me. Maybe, I believe it may have been an artillery unit that conducted that strike dead on and hit that tank like that. Because when you think about it, for the drone to be able to look away, it tells us that it wasn't most likely fired by a drone. So that tells us that it was most likely artillery. They called in the coordinates, and then the drone was looking for more targets, and then saw that one explode, and they looked at it again to confirm that the tank had been hit and was destroyed. So now we can see it burning out, and we can also see a little bit of ammo cooking off inside the turret and popping out. And so with that, that's the end of that video. Of course, it's always good to see that the Russians are taking heavy losses, because every single loss will, of course, affect their position in the area, much like the Ukrainians, though. But still, at the same time, while a single loss isn't a huge deal, multiple losses start to become something significant. And we know that the Russians have been taking massive losses pretty much over the entirety of this war, and we know at this moment that they're still taking massive losses, probably higher losses than they have during the remainder of the beginning of this war, trying to push their offensive here in the southeast. And so with that, we're now going to move into the Donetsk area, and we're going to take a look at the DPR shooting down a Ukrainian aircraft today. According to the Russians, the Ukrainian Air Force has been entirely depleted of aircraft. It is now down to 0 aircraft, and they said that about 2 weeks ago. I never showed it on stream because, of course, it's just pure propaganda, and we can see from the evidence today that a Ukrainian aircraft was shot down by the DPR, that they at least had 1 more aircraft left, and I'm sure that they actually have several still in operation, and that unfortunately one of these was shot down here. We can now hear that they fired the surface-to-air missile. Unfortunately, we can't really see a lot on the screen, but we can see the missile tracking, it seems. And it looks like it hit the aircraft, unfortunately.
Все на видео. Все, сброс ручной, азимут 30 поход, выключить высокое, застопорить солнце.
And with that, that's the end of that video. Of course, it's unfortunate to see the Ukrainians take air losses. We know that air losses for Ukraine are much more devastating to their side than the Russian side, considering that the Russians have thousands of aircraft to pull from, and the Ukrainians only had a handful at the beginning of this war, and we know that a large amount of those have already been depleted, and their air force is incredibly small at this point. So losses for them are a massive deal, and so I believe that this will be something that the Air Force will be reeling over in Ukraine for a little while, considering that this is one of the few aircraft they most likely had left. Still, you have to admire the pilots in the Ukrainian Air Force for their bravery, and knowing that they run the risk of being shot down every single day, and most of their Air Force has been destroyed, although it was incredibly small to begin with, yet they still take to the skies to try and defend their country and do whatever they can to help the soldiers on the ground. So once again, while it's an unfortunate video, it is good to know that the Ukrainians still have aircraft that are operational to be shot down in the first place. And so with that, we're now going to move further on down the Donbas, and we're going to move on to the last bit of news that we got from the Donetsk region, and then we're going to take 3 questions from the chat, and then we will carry on with the Mariupol news, the Southern Front news in general, and then we'll wrap up with the new international news in the United States, and then we'll return to the question segment. And so we can see 2 Russian Su-25s operating in the Donbass here in this video. Of course, in the usual fashion, they are flying in a pair, and they're also popping flares and chaff, I'm assuming, to try and make sure that missiles cannot lock onto them as easily and destroy them. As we do know, as I covered earlier in the stream, Ukrainian air defenses are incredibly strong, so Russians operating these kinds of missions with close air support aircraft like this is, of course, incredibly risky for the Russians. As we can see, it looks like they're trying to leave the battlefield, and they're popping most of their flares, chairs, and flaps to try and get out of there. And that's the end of that video. Not really much to explain there. It's just 2 aircraft flying in tandem, trying to leave the battlefield and popping chaff and flares as much as possible to make sure that they don't get shot down by the superb anti-air defense units of Ukraine. And so with that, we have reached the end of the news in the Donbass. And we're now about to move on to the Mariupol news, the news from the rest of the Southern Front, the news that we've gotten inside of Moldova. It's not really news, but it's showing a little bit of a military drill that they conducted recently in a picture from it, and then finally the international news. But before we get to all of that, we're going to answer 3 questions from the chat. So with that, what do we got, Matthew?
All right. So up next, we have a $35 donation from Jude Odom Nail. I'm butchering that. I know I am, but please forgive me. So the question they ask is, or more like a comment, great channel. I've listened since the early days. Please do Ukrainian Foreign Legion news as often as you can, as little as often reported. Thank you.
I try and do as much news as possible on everyone if I can find it, but then again, I have to find the news in the first place to be able to report on it. And sadly, ever since the Northern Front has collapsed, I haven't gotten any news at all on the Foreign Legion, the American Volunteers, or really any foreign unit for that matter. I'm not really sure if the Ukrainians have withdrawn them from the fighting and are keeping them in some kind of reserve area, or giving them a large amount of R&R to make sure that they don't take a heavy amount of losses, considering that the Ukrainians have now said themselves that the Eastern Front has really turned into a meat grinder for them and the Russians. So I believe that they may be trying to keep them out of the fighting over there, so that way it doesn't look like they're throwing the foreigners into the meat grinder to save some Ukrainians in a way. I'm not really entirely sure, but of course there's a lot of political concerns there, considering that the unit is made up of entirely foreigners. So unfortunately, I haven't been able to get a lot of news once again on them. In fact, I haven't heard any news about them, and I am looking as hard as I can to try and find every bit of news I can, but unfortunately I just haven't seen anything about them. But I do thank you so much for the support, and I will try and get an answer to that question about what the Foreign Legion has been up to if I'm able to find the news. And so I thank you so much for the support, and I hope that does answer the question of why there hasn't been any news on them. And with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And up next, we have a $30 donation from a longtime channel supporter, Paolo Curadini. He says, in reference to what you said earlier, could you please elaborate on what a smart guided artillery munition actually is? It seems counterintuitive that one could guide a shell. Slava Ukraine.
It does seem counterintuitive, and I thank you so much for the support. And to answer that question, we're going to look at a very specific shell, the Excalibur round, which is used by the M777 howitzer. So this is actually one of the smart guided munitions, as we can see here. It looks pretty smart. It doesn't look like your normal artillery round. I'm just saying that sarcastically. But the actual explanation behind this round is that apparently it can be guided by GPS. So like we're looking at Google Maps right here, and this is a very, very crude example. This is probably not how it operates. But let's say that we zoom into this town here of Pokrovsk, and we're looking at this train yard, and we know that there is a train on this specific train track right here. You can input the GPS coordinates into that artillery shell, pretty much, load it into the artillery piece, and then fire it, and that round will make sure to guide itself directly onto that pinpoint dot, specifically on that railroad track, and hit it. So that's kind of how smart guided artillery munitions work in a very, very crude example. Of course, I'm not really an expert on how most systems work in the military, but that's really the gist of how GPS guided anything works, is that it's looking at a map, it usually has coordinates, and it just guides itself directly to those specific coordinates and then hits that location. So I hope that kind of answers the question in a way, and there's actually multiple examples of that. The United States, of course, is not the only country to field such a smart round like the M982 Excalibur. There are other countries out there like the United Kingdom and France that have developed their own smart guided munitions, and I believe that the Russians may have a small number of them as well. But I do hope that answers the question in a way and kind of gives a context of how the artillery has become that much more effective, considering that they're starting to pretty much supply the artillery with smart munitions, which may be giving the Ukrainians the upper hand as far as artillery accuracy. So I thank you very much for the question and the support. It does help out our channel a lot, and it does help us to keep doing what we do. Once again, I want to just say, I hope y'all have enjoyed the shorts, and I hope y'all noticed that I don't run ads on them, because I don't like ads, so I just make sure not to run them. And so with that, thank you so much for the support once again. It's the only way we run this channel. And with that, we're going to move on to the last question of this segment, and then we're going to start covering the Southern Front news, the Moldova news, and then the international news.
And next up, we have a $20 donation from Leaf Spring Army. And I absolutely love that username. Very cool. His comment is, "Thanks for everything you're doing, guys. Consolidating these clips into organized daily summary is a huge service. You're helping get out the truth. It's no wonder the Russian bots hate your channel."
That's entirely true, and some of the new viewers who may be here tonight may not know that we actually have endured a large amount of bot attacks on this channel. There's really no other way to explain it at this point. I've tried to make sure not to say that too much, because then it sounds like I'm like using that like people use false flag. But we've actually had a large amount of bot attacks on this channel that have taken down the streams numerous times, and we know that they're bot attacks directly on the stream because other streamers that are streaming about the news in Ukraine also go down on the same days as us, and then their connection is fine all the other times that they're on. And also, our internet will be totally fine here at our house because Matthew and me are in the same house. And we'll be able to talk to each other on Discord perfectly fine, yet the stream will be absolutely falling apart and collapsing in on itself. So the bots do hate us, and I guess that is a bit of a credit of a pretty decent job of what we're doing, reporting the news and most of the locations and front lines. We also had the Russians copy our map at one point, which was hilarious and really weird in a way. I know that they're probably not watching this stream, honestly, but it was very crazy to see that the maps were literally identical on the one day that it happened. So I thank you so much for the support once again, and with that, we have reached the end of this question segment. And so I thank you all so much for sending in your support, and I hope I did answer your questions the best I could. If you did send in a live chat tonight, I do thank you so much for the support, and we will, of course, get to those later on at the end of the stream and answer every single one of them. So just hang tight, and we will get to y'all's question very soon. And we also thank you all so much once again for the support. And now we're going to move on into the area of Mariupol. And I wanted to show y'all a video today. This isn't exactly war news. This is actually a contrast of what Mariupol looked like before and after the fighting has occurred inside the city. And it's just so sad, really, because Mariupol was an incredibly pretty city on this video. And so I'm going to let y'all see this, and then I'm going to let y'all, of course, see the direct compare and contrast in between what Mariupol looked like before and during the war. So as we can see here, this is Mariupol before the war. We can actually see the theater right there, which was still intact, of course, and also the large basilica. I'm not exactly sure if they're called churches in Ukraine. I believe it's actually called a basilica. But you can just see that they had such nice stuff there, and it was beautiful. It had large parks. Of course, that was once again at the theater. And it was a very pretty city. I mean, like, I would actually like to have traveled there if I had known about it. Now we can see here in the video. I'm going to mute it. Hopefully it doesn't play music again. And now it's playing music. And that's actually footage of the Russian Victory Day parade. They're just trying to show that for dramatic effect. I'm not wanting anyone to think that they fly strategic bombers that slowly and also a refueling plane over Mariupol. They did not do that. That's actually military parade footage. But now we can see the bombing occur in the Azovstal. And you can see it literally rocking the buildings apart with the explosions. You can actually see the carpet bombing of the Azovstal there, which occurred a while ago. We actually showed that on stream. We can now, of course, see a load of the footage of the MLRS attacks that we once again covered on this channel, and the tanks fighting in the city in the early days when it hadn't taken a large amount of damage, and most of the buildings were intact, and actually were in their normal condition. We can now see more buildings being hit, of course. We can see the same residential building being fired upon still. And now we can actually see what Mariupol looked like after about a month of fighting in the city. Most of the city had already been destroyed, and at this point, just 1 month into the fighting, and we're already 2 months and 1 week into it, the mayor of Mariupol declared that 85 to 90% of the buildings in Mariupol had been entirely destroyed at that point, and the battle for that city still continued a month afterwards. Here we can see the theater, which was once the pride of the city, one of the cultural hubs, and also one of the icons of the city's landmarks, had been completely destroyed in a Russian strike. There were hundreds of people hiding in that theater, and there were dozens killed and hundreds trapped inside of the building. The defenders of the city, of course, tried to get out as many as possible, but there wasn't many people left to save, and that gives you a bit of an idea of the atrocities that the Russians have committed. You can see here a man that's most likely in trauma. And this video here is actually from the Azovstal bunker that's under the Azovstal metallurgical plant, where most of the defenders and the citizens left in the city are trying to hide right now. So with that, that's the end of the video. You can kind of get an idea of what these people used to live in. They actually lived in a very nice looking town from what we could tell on that video, and now they live in an absolute hellscape that the Russians have created entirely on their own, and it's just terrible to think about. Really think about that though, everyone, because we're all sitting here in our worlds. You know, I live in Alabama, and I live near a big city, and so I drive into the big city every once in a while. And it's a very nice place. You know, it's not perfect. No big city's ever perfect, but it's still a nice place nonetheless. And think about if you were to be living in a city like you are right now, and then over the course of the next month, that city went from looking the way it does. Of course, Detroit wouldn't change, just to the people who live in Detroit here on the stream. But over a course of a month, that city would go from looking the way it does to being completely burned out. It would be a danger to go into the city because you could possibly be killed by enemy forces, and you have to pretty much hide and pray that the soldiers don't come by your house and kill you, or you get hit by a stray artillery shell or one that was directly aimed at you. And you got to imagine and put yourself in those people's shoes, and that'll give you a pretty good idea of how those people probably feel, because they were people just like us. Times they were living in pretty good times over there in Mariupol, and now they've been put in the worst situation that we've ever seen in this century. And so I hate to think about that, and I hope that that the Ukrainians and the Russians are able to make some kind of agreement where the Ukrainians will actually be able to get out of the city, defenders, civilians, and all. And so, of course, there's not really much hope for that. The Russians have, of course, violated multiple humanitarian corridors before set up with the city. And so we're now going to move on to the next bit of news from inside of Mariupol. Starting off inside of the Azovstal, once again, to add on to a bit of the doom and gloom in Mariupol, because while they're not being pushed right now inside the Azovstal by the Russians, there, of course, are dire situations occurring inside of the bunker. Here we can see a large group of children hunkering down inside of the Azovstal and having to sleep like sardines in a can because the space in the bunker is so limited. I hate to see this stuff, because imagine if you were a kid, you know, and all of y'all were kids at one point, and you're being put in such a terrible condition like this. I mean, like, the kids just go along with it. They don't really know any better. They probably think that their parents are playing some kind of weird game, and that's probably how the parents have explained it to them, or some of them have explained it to them, frankly, that the Russians are actually trying to kill them all. But still, imagine being in those kinds of conditions as a kid. And imagine that these kids are in well, you don't even have to imagine. This is just pure fact. That these kids are in peril every single day they're in that city. These kids could die any minute from a deliberate Russian attack on that area. We know the Russians have killed several hundred kids at this point, somewhere around 300. And these kids could be the next ones. And so I hope that encourages y'all to call up your senators and representatives, although we can't provide any more military support to Ukraine because we've given them the full 9 yards at this point. and maybe have the United States put serious political pressure on Russia, if we're even able to anymore, to try and open up some kind of humanitarian corridor to Mariupol and evacuate these poor women and children that are currently inside of this bunker out of there, at least, and maybe the defenders as well, although that will probably be an incredibly far stretch. So, with that, we're now going to move on to the last bit of news from Mariupol, where we can see a 2S1 fire directly into the Azovstal today. Although the action and the fighting in the city has largely died down, there is, of course, the occasional probing attack by the Russians into the Azovstal, and we can see an instance of that here with this with this 2S1. Sorry, correction. And so I'm going to unmute this and let y'all watch this very short clip.
Yes.
And so with that, that is the end of that video, of course, and it just shows that the Russians are still launching light attacks on the Azovstal, although they're not as heavy as they once were. And so with that, we're now going to move on outside of Mariupol and, of course, hope that those children and the women that are currently stuck there can make it out, and hopefully the defenders can go with them. And so we're now going to move out of the Mariupol area, and we're now going to move towards Zaporizhia, where today we can see a proper example of how artillery should be conducted. Here we can see the Ukrainian artillery working incredibly hard and firing at a rapid pace. And it was deleted. So we won't be seeing that. Hate to say that. So unfortunately, I can't show you all that. But compared to the LPR footage that we saw a while ago, where they were firing the gun like it was some kind of social event, the Ukrainians were actually working their gun. They were firing it and reloading it in under 10 seconds, which is fairly fast considering the drills that they were using. It looked like they actually had to walk a decent ways to actually reach the gun and then reload it. And so with that, we're now going to move out of the southern front in general. There's not really a lot of news left in there. And so we're now going to move into the Black Sea, where we've actually seen a change in strategy, it seems, by the Russians as a response to the Moskva flagship of the Black Sea Fleet being sunk by Neptune anti-ship missiles. We can now see the Russians launching cruise missiles by submarine. So I'm going to let y'all see this footage real quick. It is, of course, incredibly quiet, and there's not much to see because it is a submarine firing them, but you can see the cruise missiles being fired from underwater and then taking flight. So this is, of course, something to take note of, because it is showing that the Russians are learning, at least in the naval field, and they're actually going to start using submarines to make sure that they don't take as many losses or any losses as compared to what they have been previously enduring, which is the sinking of their flagship, which cost $750 million to build. And so with that, that's the end of that video. Of course, you could see there that the Russians launched a cruise missile from the submarine, much like I said, and so it is showing a change in tactics. And so we're not really going to cover that too much. We've already covered that before the video. And we're now going to move into the area of Transnistria, where I'm going to ask y'all a question. Does this look like World War II, or does this look like the modern era? Because this is a picture from a recent military drill that has been conducted in Transnistria. Here we can see the usual Russian infantrymen from the Battle of Berlin advancing in an open field with what appears to be an ancient armored personnel carrier. I don't even know what kind of designation that armored personnel carrier has. It looks like it was a makeshift vehicle made out of spare parts. But you can tell that they don't really look like they're in any better condition. They may even be in worse condition than the LPR and DPR troops. So I hope that y'all take a good look at this and give me some answers here, because we're going to move on real quick. But still, these guys look like they're from World War II. I mean, like, look at the kid. This guy actually has like a little wool cover for his canteen. These guys are wearing like old shish helmets. They're so old, they're like that brighter green that they used to use back in like the 40s and the 50s. So I don't really think these guys will be posing much of a threat. And I hope this kind of quells the questions here on this stream about, will the Russians use Transnistria to push into Ukraine? Do you really think these people, in the condition they're in, could do anything? I don't think so. And also, this guy here, he doesn't even have a magazine. Like, look at that. This AK has no magazine. What's he going to do? None of them have magazines. Look at that. Of course, it's a training drill, but you would think that they at least have enough equipment to give them at least empty magazines. But still, they didn't. I bet you this guy doesn't even actually have a gun. I'm sure that's just a wooden stick painted black. And so with that, that's all we've got on that. We're now going to move out of Moldova and Transnistria, really in particular, and we're now going to move over to the United States, specifically in California, where we've seen today that more supplies are on the way, as pictures were uploaded showing that we were sending over more arms to Ukraine. As we can see it being loaded in what looks like is most likely a C-5 Galaxy, with the flag of the U.S. Air Force, the United States, and the California Republic being clearly seen, which of course gave us a really good idea that this plane was in California. So with that, that is the end of the news for today. I hope you have all enjoyed the news and heard something interesting that you maybe have not heard from other news sources. If you are new to the channel, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the stream. We upload these we actually run these streams every single night of the week except for Mondays at 10:10 p.m. Eastern Time. So make sure to subscribe if you would like to hear this news every single night and get the up-to-date news that really no one else is giving at this point. So I thank you all once again, and with that, we're now going to move on to the questions. And so, how many super chats do we have, Matthew?
So let's see here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. We have about 15.
All right. And so, with that, we're going to start off with the first question. And so, what do we got, Matthew?
So first up, we have a $50 donation from a longtime channel supporter, Al M. He says, "Thanks for your hard work. I can't watch every night. I need my sleep, but it's Friday, so buy pizza. The dynamics of the conflict are changing. Weather, newer heavy equipment to Ukraine, news outside borders. And do you think a May 9th push by Russia will be an overextension?"
I believe, and I also thank you very much for the support because you've been a long-time channel supporter and you are helping us to run this thing. But to answer your questions, yes, a lot of things have changed. The weather has changed a large deal. It's gone from being incredibly cold to the point that snowfall is a normal occurrence to now it's gotten warm enough that the Razputitsas may be drying out for the large part around most of the country. And so that muddy slush that the tanks could not operate in at the beginning of the war is now starting to go away, and the Russians will start to endure better weather here soon, which may actually benefit their tactics. Moving beyond that statement about the weather and how they'll probably affect Russian tactics, a May 9th push by Russia would probably be an overextension, and I really think that they're trying to hurriedly make some kind of push that will make some ground before May 9th, because May 9th is supposed to be Victory Day, not making a Victory Day. So I'm sure that they're actually trying to achieve some kind of objective in the area before May 9th, so that way there's something to celebrate on May 9th that is occurring during this war, instead of trying to come up with something on the day of. But I do think, regardless whether the push happens on May 9th or before, that the Russians are still overextending at this point. We can see that they're having an incredibly hard time around most of the front. Well, actually all the front, as far as we know right now, gaining any meaningful ground. And so that gives me a pretty good idea that they're already overextended, and pushing any further would just make that situation even that much worse. So I hope that answers the question. And with that, we're now going to move on to the next question.
And next up, we have a $25 donation from Rated PG, who says, "You guys do great work. I look forward to all of your streams. Here's some inflation-adjusted goodness to help keep my eyes glued to your videos. Slava Ukraine."
Heroam Slava, and I thank you so much for the support. I'm glad that it is inflation adjusted. We do know that inflation has been kind of taking off here in the United States recently, but hopefully it's stabilized incredibly soon, because inflation at this rate is not good for any nation's economy. So I thank you very much once again for the support, and I will make sure to put that toward running this channel. And so I thank you so much once again, and with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And next up, we have a $20 donation from Eliza A, who says, "Thank you, Enforcer Brothers, for all of your hard work."
Well, I thank you so much for the support, and I'm glad that you enjoy the amount of hard work we put into this. Also, everyone, make sure, if you do enjoy the stream, make sure to hit the like button. Of course, the Leaf Spring Army can do anything, and so I'm sure that we can reach 2,000 likes here within the next 10 minutes, most likely. So let's try and hit 2,000 likes here, y'all. And with that, I thank you once again so much for the support and enjoying our streams. We do try and put a large amount of effort into them, and of course, we'll be putting in massive volumes of effort tomorrow trying to get that film kind of like filmed and then go into the editing phase afterwards. And so I thank you so much once again for the support. It helps us out a huge deal. And with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And just for the folks asking, just real quick, we really don't try to censor your speech in the chat, but We like to keep politics out of the chat just so that way we don't have any unnecessary arguments and we can keep our focus on Ukraine. Um, Obviously, we have our own political beliefs, so we agree with some of you and we disagree with some of you, but we're not going to get into that tonight. But let's try to keep politics out of the chat if we could, please, so we can stay focused on Ukraine. Up next here, we have a $20 donation from Neil Wojon, who says, "Did you see that the PTFC in Portland hosted a free exhibition match to benefit Ukraine? There's a large Ukraine population in PDX. They opened with the Ukraine anthem, hauntingly beautiful. Check it out. It's super inspiring."
Well, thank you very much for the support, and I will make sure to go and check that out. It's something that I don't really know much about. Of course, my attention has been entirely focused on the war inside of Ukraine and the small extenuating circumstances like those stuff we've seen in the United States today that directly play into how the ground war is unfolding. So unfortunately, I haven't really heard about that or seen it, but I will go and make sure to try and check it out after the stream. And so I thank you so much for the support, and I hope that does answer the question. And with that, we're going to move on to the next one.
And next up, we have a $10 donation from Darth Fred, who says, "Enforcer, what in your opinion would be good targets for a Ukrainian counteroffensive?"
I think good targets for Ukrainian. Well, that's kind of playing into talking about what the Ukrainians will do, and we've been largely accurate on this channel with what the Russians will do. Of course, we predicted these two areas of advance in yellow actually a couple of days before the Russian offensive began, and they were actually dead on. So I don't really want to go too far into what I think the Ukrainians should do because my thing is, what if I'm right with them, and what if that's giving someone out there some extra information to work with? And so it's kind of been a general policy of mine to make sure that I don't really cover a lot of information about the Ukrainians, their strength, their numbers, what's moving around, if I have any information on it, because that, of course, can be of detriment to the Ukrainians. As the saying goes, loose lips sink ships. And so I don't really want to have loose lips and talk too much about what the Ukrainians could do. But I am seeing some areas on the front, of course, that the Ukrainians could take advantage of if they're able to conduct large offensives, for example, near Kharkiv. But I'm not really going to talk about that too much. Again, I just think that the Kharkiv area has some potential in it from what we're seeing and how the front line is developed up there. And so I thank you so much for the support. Unfortunately, I don't really want to answer that question too well because, of course, the prediction so far about what the Russians will do was pretty right, and I don't want to do the same thing about the Ukrainians because what if that helps out the Russians? So I thank you very much for the support. I hope that kind of answered the question, and with that, we're going to move on to the next one.
And up next, I want to recognize a $20 donation from Ashley. Thank you very much for your donation to the channel, and we very much appreciate your support. Up next, we have a $10 donation from a longtime channel supporter, Junebug72, who says, "Keep up the great work, and thank you. Slava Ukraine from California."
Well, thank you so much for the support. And what's crazy is that we actually had California here on the news just a second ago, since a large amount of supplies were being loaded up there, and they will be sent to Ukraine soon. So that's really cool. And I also thank you so much for the support. It is cool to know that we, of course, have international viewers and national ones that span across the entire nation from coast to coast. And so I thank you so much once again for the support. It does mean a lot to us here at the channel, and it does help us to keep on running. And so with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And up next here, we have a $10 donation from Alan, who says, "How's those leaf spring equipped seals doing? LOL, have fun tomorrow."
Well, thank you so much for the support. And the leaf spring equipped seals are doing incredibly well. Of course, it's really hard for them to hang on to the leaf springs because they actually don't have fingers. But still, they're doing incredibly good. So with that, I believe the answer is they're doing fairly well, and I think they'll do a fairly good job. Also, one thing I would like to touch on, because Matthew touched on it just a second ago, is that we keep American politics out of the stream. I know that there's a lot of people out there who say war is politics, but the thing is that the Ukraine war, which is a war in between Ukraine and Russia, really doesn't have a lot to do with American politics. American politics is something largely backwater here on this channel, and if I bring that up, you've got to understand that if I bring up American politics on this stream and weigh in on it, this stream will no longer be about the war in Ukraine. It'll be about the war in politics in the United States, and then Ukraine will take the back foot to that. So I make sure to keep a neutral stance, and I will actually continue to keep a neutral stance even when we expand into videos that are covering different topics that aren't Ukraine, because I believe that news reporting should be unbiased and shouldn't be trying to have a biased opinion in any sort of political sphere sphere, unless if it's one pertaining to a war where we can clearly see an aggressor and a defender who legally did nothing wrong during their entire history. So I hope that kind of answers to some of y'all who may have never heard that from me, why we don't really talk about American politics in here, because I want this to be entirely about Ukraine, the struggles, the lives, and the deaths of their people, who are much more important than the minor political squabbles we keep on seeing in the United States that occur every other day. So I hope y'all kind of understand where I'm coming from there, because I want to respect the Ukrainians more so than the politicians here in the United States and give the Ukrainians the attention they deserve. So with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And trust me, folks, I'm a political science major. I love to discuss politics to the end of the earth, but it's nice to have a break from politics. Trust me, it's good to have a break. And luckily, the stream is just focused on Ukraine, so we can get a break of politics at least for a few hours. So up next, we have a question from a longtime channel supporter, Praise Adonai, who puts in a $20 donation and says, "Enforcer, Israel has agreed to send Iron Dome systems to the Ukraine. Do you think these would be placed near the larger cities, and how would they be effective against the grads?"
Well, wow. I don't know how effective they would be against the grads. I've never really looked too much into the Iron Dome system. I know that they can shoot down the one-off mortar shot here and there, but I don't know if they could take on such a barrage that we can see from a single MLRS battery, because let's say each grad fires 24 rockets and you've got 4 of those grads in a single battery, and the Russians fire them all at the same time. That means that there are 96 rockets all flying at the same time, kind of in the same group towards the city. And my question is, does the Iron Dome have the capability to shoot down that many rockets in such a short amount of time before they can actually hit that city? And that's something I don't know, because I'm not an Iron Dome expert. But it is, of course, incredibly cool to know that the Israelis are giving one of the best missile defense systems in the world to the Ukrainians, and I'm sure that they're actually going to set that up around Kyiv, Lviv, most importantly, because the Russians like to hit there and there's nothing really going on, and that's also an important staging area for them logistically, and also with foreign volunteers that are entering the country. I assume that they would probably, and this isn't really giving much away, because if the Ukrainians put the Iron Dome there, it will be known. Both sides will know this clearly. I'm sure they're going to put some around the major cities like Kharkiv, Severodonetsk, Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, Zaporizhia, and Dnipro, because those are large cities that are still near the front lines. And most certainly Mykolaiv, because we've seen them endure a large amount of artillery fire for no good reason. They're not even on the front lines anymore, but they're still getting blasted almost like every other day by Russian artillery. So I do believe it would be put around the major cities. But then again, that still entirely revolves around how much of an Iron Dome system are they getting? How many units of it? And then that'll kind of determine how far they're able to go in defending all of their major cities, or just some of them in the more vulnerable areas. So I hope that kind of answers the question in a way, at least as far as what I know and my opinion on it. So I thank you very much for the support. And with that, we're going to move on to the next question.
And up next, I want to recognize a $20 donation from Hellpug. Thank you very much for your donation. We appreciate it, and that's a cool username.